All right, good morning, everybody. So today marks a turning point in the semester. Up until now, we've done the first 5 lessons. We're now into the 6th lesson, which is like this inflection point. It's a very one of the most challenging lessons. And in some ways, if you're familiar with the Matrix, it's sort of like the red pill moment. It's the moment where we start to look at how reality is socially constructed, how the things that we take for granted are actually, in a way, socially and culturally constructed. And they are not really real, and we can make new realities if we understand how our social realities are made. And that's true freedom, and that's, in a way, what Martin Luther King was talking about. He was imagining a new society where we didn't have racism, and we didn't have the divisions that we have in our society. And that ultimately is what he meant by true freedom. So this is lesson 6, right? Most of what we take as reality is a cultural construction. It gets realized through our unseen, unexamined assumptions of what is right, true, or possible. I want to start off with a story about Brian Bushway. He's a guy who was an ordinary kid playing hockey as a child, and then he started to notice he couldn't follow the puck. He went to the doctor one day, and the doctor said that his optical nerves were deteriorating, and he went back to the doctor to sort of do some experiments and see if they could figure what was going on. The way he says it is like the doctor turned the lights out and they didn't come back on, and he was completely blind from then on. Here's a quick vision of what his reality looked like after that.
I was at a loss, and I really did feel very limited. I couldn't find my way out of my room. And how was I then going to figure out ways to navigate the world? It was a completely overwhelming thought. And it threw me into an identity crisis of where do I fit in life? What does it mean to be a whole human being? Nobody really wants to deal with you anymore. And so you really feel this tension of exclusion. And it happens because we all think if we can't see, we can't do anything.
Okay, now that's a reality that's actually being realized. If you can't see, you can't do anything. And there was actually a whole book written about this by a sociologist named Robert Scott called The Making of Blind Men. And the idea here is that this is a really radical idea. He's suggesting that blindness is actually a social construction. The idea that blind people can't do those things, that they can't do certain things, is a social construction. That maybe they actually could do those things if we didn't create that reality. And so the way it looks like is this, is that we have certain beliefs. These are the social constructions, you might say, like just ideas about what is and is not possible or true or right. And those beliefs shape our behaviors. And so there's a relationship between our beliefs and our behaviors. But there's also another level to this, and that is all of our behaviors collectively create the social structure, the cultural structure that we live in. And so ultimately, all of these things end up shaping each other. And this is the most important part that we need to face when we take a belief that somebody has. And some of these beliefs are quite serious and important. We have to transform all these elements before the belief can really go away and change. If you keep the structure in place, it just recreates the old belief. If you keep the behaviors in place, it recreates the old belief. So somehow we have to overcome all of these all at once. Ultimately, what happens to Brian is this sort of epiphany one day. I wanted to summarize this, right? That the belief here is that blind people can't do those things. The behavior is that blind people don't do those things. And the structure is that institutions are created to help blind people do those things. And by helping people to do those things, the blind people then don't do those things, and then they actually can't do those things, reinforcing the belief that they can't do those things. So here's how you can see all these things related. But then Brian has a breakthrough.
But there was one day when my life changed forever. I had learned the route to my 8th grade class, and I was walking by myself with my cane. And I was just walking down the center of the hallway, but I could tell that there was a pillar and an open space, and a pillar and open space. I swear I could see these things, and I touched them to confirm what they were. There was a pillar. What I was doing was passively echolocating these objects. It's human sonar.
So he learned to start clicking, and the clicks would bounce off of the things in his environment. He got to where he could not only notice things that were in his way, but he actually identify those things. He could tell the difference between a tree and a bush. He could tell you that the bush is fat at the bottom and gets thinner at the top. He can actually do this. He can even ride a bike. And he does all of these, he skateboards, he does all kinds of things using sonar.
If human beings can see with sound, what else is possible? Echolocation gave me real connection to my physical environment, which then gave me greater freedom to my social environment. The better I was at mobility, the easier it was to make friends and to do things with people.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Everybody has something to learn from echolocation, and that is that we all are capable of so much more than we previously thought. We're now just discovering in humanity that a person who is labeled blind can learn to image their world acoustically. Like, this keeps life kind of fresh. We are really living in a new era of exploring the question, what can blind people see? I mean, it's sort of a temporary state because now we can actually teach our brains to image acoustically. People often ask me, Brian, do you wish you could see? And my response is, I already can.
Actually done studies on people like Brian, and there's many of them now. What happens when they're echolocating is the visual cortex of their brain actually lights up, just like ours lights up when we use our eyes. And they've done studies and found that their vision, what they see, is basically equivalent to what you see out of your peripheral vision. And that's not so bad. You know, it's not perfect, but you can't read things out of your peripheral vision, but you know that things are over there and out there, and it's pretty remarkable. And it just goes to show like that we can overcome what we thought was a clear reality and instead realize that some of these realities are actually constructed. And what happens though is, this is lesson 7, sort of jumping ahead, is that we often fail to examine our assumptions and our realities, not just because they're hard to see, but also because they're safe and comfortable. And this is why your challenge 6 is actually to get uncomfortable. When you're safe and comfortable, these assumptions allow us to live with the flattering illusion that I am the center of the universe and what matters are my immediate needs and desires. And ultimately, this is jumping ahead to lesson 10, what heroes who have broken through these social realities can show us is that we make the world. And understanding how we make the world, how it could be made or understood differently, is the road toward realizing our full human potential. It is the road to true freedom. And we're going to try to take on some really big realities today, including this social reality of race. And the basic argument of the day is that race is actually a biological illusion. It's a myth that's been created for us, and that we can actually potentially move past it. But we have to recognize that it's embedded not only in belief, but also in behaviors and in the structure. And perhaps then we can move toward true freedom as Martin Luther King had hoped that we would. So this is, in a way, our pursuit of true freedom. So I want to take you back to April 4th, 1968. This is the day Martin Luther King was shot and killed. And after that, Jane Elliott was back in her schoolroom. She taught these 3rd graders in Iowa. And these Iowa kids had really never seen a black person. So this was like a very foreign reality to them. She thought it was really important to drive home the importance of Martin Luther King Jr. and what he meant for America. And so when the kids came in that day, she started a little experiment, and it's a pretty shocking thing to do. She started essentially discriminating between brown-eyed people and blue-eyed people, and this is what it looks like.
I mean, the blue-eyed people are the better people in this room. Oh, yes, they are. Blue-eyed people are smarter than brown-eyed people.
My dad isn't that stupid.
Is your dad brown-eyed?
Yeah.
One day you came to school and you told us that he kicked you.
He did.
Do you think a blue-eyed father would kick his son?
Yeah. My
dad's blue-eyed. He's never kicked me. Greg's dad is blue-eyed. He's never kicked him. Rex's dad is blue-eyed. He's never kicked him. This is a fact. Blue-eyed people are better than brown-eyed people. Are you brown-eyed or blue-eyed?
No.
Why are you shaking your head?
I don't know.
Are you sure that you're right? Why? What makes you so sure that you're right?
I don't know.
The blue-eyed people get 5 extra minutes of recess, while the brown-eyed people have to stay in. The brown-eyed people do not get to use the drinking fountain. You'll have to use the paper cups. You brown-eyed people are not to play with the blue-eyed people on the playground. because you are not as good as blue-eyed people. Well, the brown-eyed people in this room today are going to wear collars so that we can tell from a distance what color your eyes are. On page 127. 127. Is everyone ready? Everyone but Laurie. Ready, Laurie?
Brown-eyed.
She's a brown-eyed. You'll begin to notice today that we spend a great deal of time waiting for brown-eyed people. The yardstick's gone. Well, okay. I don't see the yardstick. Do you?
It's probably over there. Hey, mister, you better keep that on your desk so if the brown-eyed people get out of hand.
Oh, you think if the brown-eyed people get out of hand, that would be the thing to use? Who goes first to lunch?
Blue-eyed.
The blue-eyed people. No brown-eyed people go back for seconds. Blue-eyed people may go back for seconds. Brown-eyed people do not.
Brown-eyed.
Don't you know?
Oh, they're not smart.
Is that the only reason?
It'll take too much.
It might take too much. Okay, quietly.
They then tested in the afternoon, and they would find that because the brown-eyed people had been discriminated against all day, they were really down on themselves, and it would take them a long, long time to finish the exams, and they actually did very poorly. Then the next day she flipped it, and she said, oh, by the way, I was kidding yesterday. It's actually that brown-eyed people are much better than blue-eyed people, and she reversed the discrimination, and the test results also reversed. And you remember how this actually manifests in our real lives, that I told you the story about Jay Stone's miniature golf course, in which when they were told that this is all about raw athletic ability, then black students outperformed white students, and when the students were told that it was measuring geometry and your ability to see geometry, white students outperformed black students. And this is just what people were told, so their beliefs were actually shaping their actual performance in these things. And this is how the triad of realization starts to work. We have these beliefs, many of them unexamined and implicit, and we're not even aware of them, but they shape our behaviors. And then our behaviors collectively create our structures. And so we live now in a society that actually is deeply divided in many ways based on these really subtle racial beliefs and ideas. When you see the triad of realization, this is how our realities ultimately get realized. So I can actually do a quick survey here. How many people in this room are racist? So nobody raises their hand, okay. This is a typical answer. How many people in this room think there are racists in this room? Yeah, almost everybody. Not everybody, but almost everybody. So it turns out that that's about all you need to create the triad of realization, to get it rolling. Because then what happens is a whole slew of things that end up with the society we have today, where we have this huge wealth gap, where whites have 16 times the wealth of blacks. If you think about a baby born today, a black baby is about 3 times more likely to die than a white baby. You look at what happens when they've done studies where they create resumes and they put Jamal on the top of it rather than, or Brendan. And of course, Jamal sounds like a black name. Brendan sounds like a white name. And Brendan gets 50% more interviews than Jamal does. And then there's all these other little subtle things, right? Like where we look out in the world and we see white people, we see black people, and then black people are called upon to represent their entire race. Or white people have this privilege of being totally unaware of their own privilege. Like when there's a terrible massacre of some sort, white people don't have to worry about being labeled as terrorists. So we're going to talk today about building the Troost Wall, which is an actual sort of physical reality. It's not a physical reality, right? There's no Troost Wall, but people talk about the Troost Wall. How many people know what the Troost Wall is when I say the word Troost Wall? Okay, so for those of you who don't know, Troost is a street in Kansas City, and you know it when you cross it because you go from essentially a white neighborhood to a black neighborhood just like that, and it goes from rich to poor just like that. And I can actually take you inside this. This is what it looks like on a scatter plot of population. You can see there where the blue is black families, black households, the red is whites. So here we go. Going into Kansas City. This is the plaza. This is just 1 mile west of Troost. of what's called the Troost Wall. And you can see it's, I mean, tennis courts and fancy cars and fancy shops and restaurants. I'll just take you into one of these restaurants here. Fancy, like, name-dropping places here. Salads that are $29. And I'm meeting Nathaniel Bozarth here, who I'll introduce you to. Yes, please.
That's so.
Perfect. So I actually have no idea how to eat this. I'm here with Nathaniel Bozarth, class of 2012, ethnographer with Brainroot, and he's done some really cool projects with KCPT, including Your Fellow Americans and the Redream Project. And he actually interviewed the mayor on the street where he grew up, and that's where we're headed later today. So as uncomfortable as I am here, we're about to get more uncomfortable. So that was our plan for the day, was just to walk around and talk to people about Kansas City. And in the 20th century, Kansas City produced two uniquely American geniuses who would forever alter the physical and cultural landscape of our country. So one of them built this magnificent wonderland full of just basically like an escape from reality. And the other one built a theme park in California. One of them was Walt Disney. The other one is J.C. Nichols. And so J.C. Nichols created the Plaza, which is the first car-friendly mall in America. It's surrounded by million-dollar homes and country club. And it's also home to where lots of ordinary people live as well, where J.C. Nichols built these world-class neighborhoods that Americans started moving into in the 50s after they returned home from the war and so on. It's all close to the shopping. For example, Prairie Village was the #1 development in America in the 1950s. But that's all to the west of the plaza. We're walking to the east. Or not, but currently white people count about 300, black people count 4.
That's where we're at.
So there's, you know, all these museums and shuttlecocks on the lawn of the museum, glass labyrinths, manicured lawns, kids fishing, and fancy sidewalks. And then you get to Troost. Everything changes. Everything you just saw, the beautiful lake, the kids fishing, that's like 2 blocks that way. And now we're crossing over to Troost. And you can see behind me there's bars on the windows, and this is just the beginnings. Often called the Troost Wall because there's a major dividing line here. It divides rich, poor, black, white, and we're gonna go explore the area and see how different it is.
It's pretty ironic. We have a dead tree right behind the Troost sign.
There's just signs of poverty everywhere, like shut down stores, and this is like a donut shop we went to, and you'll see here we actually pay through glass and get our food through a steel drawer. There's no seats inside, so we sit outside.
So when white people move out and sort of hollow out the urban core, there are now fewer jobs for the black people that are still in Kansas City.
You can see there's no more manicured lawns, the sidewalks aren't so fancy. Just everything shifts at that moment. And you can actually see it on these graphs here. This is showing the division between white and black, but then you can also divide it in terms of education. It looks fairly similar. You can divide it again by looking at housing values. So if you click on a neighborhood here, you'll see that these houses are worth about $182,000. But you go across the street and the houses drop to $23,000. And if you go just a couple more blocks in, the income drops to like $14,000, and the houses are still very cheap. So the question is J.C. Nichols really the cause of this, or is it something bigger? We want to analyze like this social reality that's been created, where on one side you have extreme wealth, and on the other you have extreme poverty. And on one side you have mostly white, and on the other side you have mostly black. Like, how does that happen? So there's a bit of a paradox in this that we need to start off with, and that is what Time magazine identified as this back to segregation movement that was happening ever since we became presumably unsegregated. And the only way to understand how we became resegregated is to understand how the social reality was created, but also starting with a realization that it is a social reality, not a biological one. So I want to point out first and foremost that race is not a biological reality. And that seems strange to say because anybody can look around the room and say, oh, there's white people, there's black people, there's Asian people, and it's just really easy to do that. I'm not going to say there is not human variation, but scientifically it doesn't make sense to divide people into races. And here's why. So basically, if you think about like how skin color happens, like there's a vast range of skin colors in this room, and that has to do with our ancestry and so on. And it depends on where our ancestors lived. If your ancestors lived in places that had high UV radiation, lots of sun, you had different threats to your health than if you lived in cloudy areas. If you lived in cloudy areas, you had the risk of having low vitamin D, which leads to bone diseases. And if you don't survive, you don't reproduce, and so your kids over time would develop a different skin color that would protect them from low vitamin D. In high UV radiation situations, you have different types of problems. You have skin ailments like skin cancers and so on. You also have what are called NTDs, or neural tube defects. These neural tube defects lead to aborted pregnancies and whatnot, and so those people don't reproduce either. So what happens then is in low UV radiation situations like cloudy areas, you end up with low melanin and light skin, which allows vitamin D in and reduces bone diseases. Whereas in high UV radiation areas, you end up with high melanin and dark skin that protects people from skin ailments and these neural tube defects. So this is just how skin colors happen. It can happen relatively quickly throughout generations. This is what it looks like then if you go back to, say, the year 1450 and you mapped human populations, you would find that it more or less followed the level of UV radiation would match how dark the skin was. So like, for example, people in southern India actually have very dark skin, just like people in Central Africa have very dark skin. But they also have a lot of other very different traits. Some, people in Central Africa have very tight curly hair. People in southern India have straight hair. And this is where the race idea starts to break down. The idea that you can just categorize people by skin color and then put all these other pieces along with it doesn't work scientifically. What we have in science was this debate that happened up until the 1950s about these two ways to model human variation. The one was the race model, and that was sort of a typological model where you group several traits together to form a categorical race. So science in the early 1900s was actually very racist and used the category of race to explain human difference. And so they would put like black skin was associated with a number of other things, including at the time like low intelligence, low health outcomes, and so on. What they didn't realize at the time was all of those things were socially created, not biologically created. And so that was the typological model. But by the 1950s, the typological model had been overturned in science, and they'd moved toward what's called a clinal model, where you map variation in single traits. And so you're still seeing variation in humanity, but you don't say like, dark skin correlates with this or that, or white skin correlates with this or that. Instead, you're just noting that there is, in a way, you see the word cline in there, clinal, incline and decline. There's sort of an incline of colors. You go from white all the way to very dark, and that's a cline. And so you just map variation in these single traits instead of trying to categorize people into races. Nonetheless, we do end up with a social reality of race. And this social reality is created through this triad of realization, that we have these beliefs that really have their roots going back very, very far, all the way into slavery and so on, that are shaping behaviors and then shaping the structures that we see today. And we continually push against these, and our world is very different than it was 150 years ago, but obviously we still have some ways to go yet. At the turn of the century, like at 1900s, Kansas City was booming, like a lot of other American cities. And it was mostly booming on the back of industrialization and America becoming this industrial power. This is a quick clip showing what America looked like at the turn of the century.
At the turn of the 20th century, American society was riding a wave of confidence as an emerging industrial power. And the face of its power and prosperity was white. African Americans lived under the yoke of Jim Crow segregation. Most surviving Native Americans had been banished to reservations, and new immigrants crowded into urban ghettos. Disease was rampant. Death rates soared. Infant mortality was high. To many, this reflected a preordained natural order.
Those that looked wanted to confirm what they saw, which is to say that the proper place of, say, the Negro, or in other regions of the country, the Native American or the Chinese, were at the bottom of the social and political hierarchy. And if you can say that they are fundamentally biologically different, then they should be. Then it's natural for them to be at the bottom of our social hierarchy.
The biology becomes an excuse for social differences. The social differences become naturalized in biology. It's not that our institutions cause differences in infant mortality. It's that there really are biological differences between the races.
So we've emerged out of slavery, but there's still like these strong beliefs that blacks are inferior to whites. And they can actually see evidence of this in the fact that blacks are poor and they have high infant mortality rates and so on. These are all just this recreate the belief that they are inferior in some way. So then the U.S. starts to change in the 1930s with the FHA and Federal Housing Administration, which provides low-interest, long-term mortgages, which essentially creates the suburbs. And so suddenly there's this housing boom that happens all over the U.S.
Construction of new homes was beginning to increase at such a rate that the economists and financiers had to rub their eyes to be sure they could believe what they were seeing.
The entire face of the nation is being changed for the better, even to the extent of creating totally new towns. It's a familiar sight today to see such communities erected on what once were just wide open spaces. And all of this has been accomplished by the initiative of independent home builders who had the courage to venture into such projects. Now there are shopping centers, well-paved streets, parks, play areas, and sports facilities.
And so all of this suburbanization of America was happening in the 30s, 40s, 50s, but blacks were completely left out of this. They weren't even allowed to purchase these homes. So for example, all of the covenants in J.C. Nichols' property said none of the lots hereby restricted may be conveyed to, used, owned, or occupied by Negroes as owners or tenants. 96% of the lots in Johnson County were off limits to people of any color other than white. So then we had this situation where the FHA actually then supported this thing called redlining, where the banks would give the color green to upcoming neighborhoods, and then they would color red the urban core, the old neighborhoods, and they would not loan to those neighborhoods. So they fell into disrepair. Basically what happens is most people need a loan of some kind to fix a roof or fix up their house and that kind of thing. Most people just reverse mortgage or something to fix things up. The people stuck in the inner city did not have that option, and the people stuck there were black because of these racially restrictive covenants. So it wasn't just that, like, you know, you say, why didn't black people move out? They couldn't move out. They didn't have anywhere to go. And this was actually institutionalized across the nation, like in the National Association of Real Estate Brokers Code of Ethics. It says here, realtors should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood members of any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in the neighborhood. So as part of their ethical conduct, they were not allowed to show houses to people of any color except white, and so on.
Tax dollars help make the single-family home a mass-produced consumer item. The American dream had a new name: suburbia.
We came to Levittown and we found the model house, and we walked in and we looked around, and of course, in the eyes of a young man who was raised in the ghetto, so to speak, it was an interesting experience, an interesting lifestyle, seeing all the new modern conveniences, very fascinating.
Eugene Burnett came home with almost 1 million other black GIs. They had fought for the country in segregated ranks. They returned hoping for equality and the American dream. For many, that dream was a new home for little money down and some of the easiest credit terms in history.
I went up to the salesman. We're interested in your home. We're interested in buying one. And what is the procedure? Is there an application to be filled out? So forth. So he looked at me, looked around, and he said to me, he says, listen, it's not me, but the owners of this development have not as yet decided to sell these homes to Negroes.
So Levittown is just one of many examples around the country where blacks were excluded, and that happened all over Kansas City, especially in particular in Johnson County and J.C. Nichols properties. And so what happens then in Kansas City from 1950 to 1960, 1970, and so on, as suburbia is happening, as Johnson County is growing and so on, black people just don't have anywhere to go except stay in the inner city, and you start to see the Troost Wall forming at that time. Now, towards the end of the 60s, of course, you have the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks sits in the front of the bus. Martin Luther King starts leading the civil rights movement. We have the March on Washington. And finally, in 1968, we have the Equal Housing Opportunity, which creates the Fair Housing Act, which should ultimately eliminate, and it actually does by law, eliminate redlining. But what happens after that then is you have this other practice that's still happening. There's realtors going door to door or putting ads in newspapers like this. This is an actual newspaper ad from 1956. It says, colored in your block, want to sell and get all cash for prompt appraisal, etc. So basically people would go around, scare people into saying, hey, black people are moving in, your property values are going to go down, and the white families would calculate that the other white families are going to leave. The same thing that just happened in our survey today, where you're not racist, but you guess that other people in your neighborhood are racist. If they move, and lots of people move, property values plummet. So you want to be the first to sell, because otherwise if you wait too long, your property value goes way down. And now think about why that happens. That happens because if 80% of the population is white, and suddenly 80% of the population is not interested in the house, in the product, your property values are going to plummet to about 1/5 of what they once were. And that's what happens as white flight happens. So you can actually see Kansas City really struggled with this. This is an actual pamphlet that they would hand around in Kansas City trying to explain to people like, hey, let's not let white flight happen. But nonetheless, it did. So you see here, did you hear what happened to Joe Jitters when Negroes moved in across the street? And this is like a guy trying to pressure this guy to move out. So what happens then ultimately is places like Ivanhoe, which is east of Troost, the property values go to about $31,000. And you go over to Prairie Village in this area, property values are about $238,000. Now this is despite the fact that it wasn't that long ago that Troost was full of $1 million homes. And those $1 million homes sent their kids to Central High School. But after Brown versus the Board of Education, when they desegregated, you can see what happened. It went from 0% black to essentially all black within the next 20 years as those white families that lived in those $1 million homes abandoned them and went out to Johnson County. In 1984, there was a big court case that ultimately desegregated the schools and started the Magnet program, which is now the Signature program. But during that court case, they actually took the jury to tour these buildings. And these guys, they described these guys as being like real tough cowboys, some of them like professionals. They toured these buildings and they all came out with tears in their eyes. They just couldn't believe that this was the place where we'd be educating our children. That's how bad the schools were. So now you have this whole era in which white flight has happened, black families move in, property values collapse. So therefore, black families may have spent a lot of money on a house that's now worth less than they spent on it. So they're trapped in poverty, essentially, trapped in the neighborhood. They're sending their kids to these schools that have no support. The schools themselves are falling apart. Some of the people who toured the schools in the 1984 case said that they'd seen prisons that were in better shape than the schools themselves. So there was really a big problem happening here. And it was started through white flight. And this is why you can't just blame J.C. Nichols. Certainly J.C. Nichols had a big role in this by creating those racially restrictive covenants. But he would argue himself that, he was doing that to protect property values because most whites were all calculating that other whites were racist and therefore fleeing any neighborhood that had any black people move into it. So as white flight happens, property values go down quite tremendously, actually. Then they have to raise taxes as well as insurance to keep up with the needs of the neighborhoods. And so taxes go up, further trapping people in poverty. The services start to suffer, and then ultimately you hit rock bottom, and you have basically this becomes the dumping ground where highways and whatnot go right through the middle of these neighborhoods. So this is what it looks like with the resegregation of Central High School. You can see 1954, it's segregated by law, and then Brown versus the Board of Education passes that year in Topeka, not too far down the road. By 1955, it's pretty reasonable. It's sort of desegregated. Everything looks fine. And then white flight starts to happen. And you can see within just, 8 years, it's 99% black. And within 20 years, it's 100% black. So that's what Central High School looks like. Here's Paseo High School, which is further south. Same thing, 1954, 0% black. And you can see when white flight starts to happen in 1960, by 1972, it's complete. Southeast High School, even further south, same thing, just happened a bit later. So what we end up with then is that on the west side, you have the Plaza, Art Museum, $1 Million homes, it's mostly white. On the east side, pawn shops, Salvation Army, slums, mostly black. And there's a number of other things here too as well. Like by 1999, the number of loans had dropped 74% on the east side. That is like, they were just much less likely to be able to get a loan. They were 3 times more likely to be rejected for a loan, and that's controlling for income and everything. And the other thing is there's just actually no banks east of Troost. So this is what it looks like when you hit rock bottom. Here's the actual highway that went right through the neighborhood, displacing 10,000 people. There's no political capital or political will to keep these things from coming into your neighborhood. So when the US 71 went in, 10,000 people were relocated. All these people lost their homes so that this could be built to service the people who are moving out to the suburbs. This is where this sort of divide happens. And again, J.C. Nichols can kind of look at this and say, look, I'm building these neighborhoods. It's for the good of the community. And we can't have black people move in and then destroy the property values of these people who are buying them. The banks themselves would say the same thing. They'd say, look, we can't loan in these neighborhoods because when blacks move in, property values go down. And they could continually say, it's white flight that's causing it. It's everybody that's causing it. And until everybody stops moving out of these neighborhoods when black people move in, we have a massive structural problem. So ultimately, we end up in a situation where you can have a room full of people who say they are not racist, and yet we have racism. It's in a way pervasive in our society. Even if none of us hold racist beliefs, we still see segregation around us. And this is what we mean by structural racism. Structural racism is the cumulative effect of policies, systems, and processes that may not have been designed with racism in mind, but which have the effect of disadvantaging certain racial groups. And this is, in a way, the outcome of beliefs, behaviors, and then the structure. This is the structural piece of beliefs, behaviors, and structures in the realization of this reality. So you can actually think about this. What happens if we could wave a magic wand and everybody would actually be rid of their racist beliefs? Well, then everybody would sit around and they'd look at the situation. They'd say, but isn't it interesting that there's all these black people living in inner Kansas City who have very poor education outcomes, who are very poor themselves? There's going to be a bunch of people who become racist, right? You have to understand like how that actually happened in a way so that you can push back against racist ideas that might start to pop up. So somehow we have to build understanding of why these things are the way they are, and ultimately sort of attack racism at all 3 levels. Here's a map of just a Google map. If you look for banks along Troost Avenue, and you can see there's just nothing east of Troost. There's actually one now east of Troost that just went in a couple years ago. And everything else is to the west of Troost. The reason why is because if you have a bank, you're required by law to loan in your neighborhood a certain percentage of your loans. So the banks don't go east of Troost because they don't want to loan east of Troost. And this is how we get this beliefs, behaviors, and structure reinforcing each other. So ultimately we end up with this situation where, whites have 16 times the wealth of blacks, and
there is no one factor more representative of or more conducive to the economic well-being of the American citizen than the home in which he lives.
And of course, all of this is sort of the American dream of owning a house that the blacks are left out of.
The realization of the American dream, the envy of the entire world.
In a quarter mile, turn left onto Mission Road.
It's clean, it's neat, it doesn't look dilapidated, it looks cared for, it looks safe, it's quiet.
And those are the kinds of things that actually end up getting worn on people's skin. It's like, this is white space, and what we just came out of is this black space. That sense of insecurity, criminality, immorality, and so on starts to get attached to blackness in the same way that this sense of neighborhood friendliness, home, and proper citizenship, cleanliness, all these things get associated with whiteness. And it really matters. We end up wearing these judgments on our skin.
It kind of made me feel emotional that last couple blocks.
Yeah.
Like, to me, the American dream is a tradition that carries so many shackles because it allows me as a white person growing up in the suburbs to believe, hey, you know what, like, I'm going to work hard all my life and my hard work is going to pay off, and I'm going to get this idea of the American dream, a house, 2 cars, 2.78 kids, and a dog. But really, like, that idea of the American dream assumes that hard work pays off equally for everyone, and it doesn't. It just doesn't.